the other evening. Right, good every morning, everyone.
Morning.
How nice to see you all. I've nothing to add except the sun is shining and Judy is here. And I hope you enjoyed the notes. And I will move chairs and let Judy come and sit in my place. So if you bear with me a moment. I've got a pretty picture of Marion there. I wonder why. Go forward.
Yeah.
There we are.
Is that sort of central?
Oh, yeah.
Got near enough? No, it's got not near enough.
No, you need to go closer. Okay.
Not near enough? You think?
Yeah. Can anybody see Judy's head?
Yep, we're okay with that. Could be a little
Right.
bit closer, but looks good.
A little bit closer. We're trying to see your jewelry, dear.
Is that better? Is that better?
No, that's good. That's good. That's good.
Right, off you go then, Judy.
Right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your loyalty, for still being with us. We're still doing the reign of George IV, and we're doing George IV as regent. So what I thought we'd do was spend a bit of time looking at the regency period, which is very significant. As you know, it's given its, the word regent gave its name for that period of time. Interesting, because he wasn't regent for all that long. So obviously something significant, very significant things must have happened to give the name regency to that period of the early 19th century. Now, one of the significant features of the regency period was that we were at war. And if you read Jane Austen books, and I know a lot of you will have done at some stage, either as set books at school or since leaving school, you've read them for pleasure, there's very little mention of the war. Very little mention. But in fact, we were at war for many, many years against France. At first, it was called the Revolutionary War. Is this all right, Martin?
Yes, yes.
At first, it was called the Revolutionary War, and then it turned, when Napoleon made himself emperor, it turned into the Napoleonic War, or wars. Some people have called it the First World War, but that's an exaggeration. But there were various theatres of war, and of course, we were involved. In 1805, the great sea battle took place, the Battle of Trafalgar. We never had a very good, well, so we had a good army. We never had a very impressive army in terms of numbers, because we didn't have conscription. Some countries did. They made people serve in the army. We had a regular army, but we never claimed to have a particularly spectacular army. Our money, the government spent their money on the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy was, at the time and for many, many years to come, the best in the world. So our great triumph at Trafalgar was very, very impressive, and a huge victory over the French. And Horatio Nelson became a national hero. Everybody's heard of Nelson, Nelson's column, Trafalgar Square, and he was given a state funeral. He was given this great honour when he died of a state funeral in St. Paul's Cathedral. And Martin has found some pictures of that, and Martin found some wonderful pictures, some wonderful illustrations for the whole talk this morning. Obviously, there was our armies were fighting abroad, mainly in what's called the Peninsula Campaign in Spain and Portugal, which is where the Duke of Wellington, when the Duke of Wellington came to the fore, he made his name in the Peninsula Campaign. But finally, of course, his great triumph was the Battle of Waterloo. A lot of people think it was just a British army fighting against the French army, and that certainly wasn't the case. It was a multinational army which he led. And it was a close run thing, to quote the Duke himself. We really didn't win. It was only the Prussians coming along at the last minute that turned the tide of the battle and turned it into not exactly a triumph. The Duke himself was very upset.
Okay.
Okay.
And then if you want the camera off.
When he realized how many had died, when he walked over the battlefield, when the battle was over, and realized how many casualties there had been, he didn't really regard it as a great triumph and a great victory. It was a very, very expensive battle in terms of lives lost. But of course, he then became a national hero, just as Nelson had done. The Prince Regent, very oddly, seemed to think that he'd been at the Battle of Waterloo commanding the troops. A lot of people found this very strange, obviously, a very strange thing to think, and have considered that possibly he was going mad as well. He was fantasizing and had come to believe that he actually was at the battle. So people kind of went along with that. They didn't argue with him. They just went along with the idea that he believed he'd been there. He gloried in the fact that it was one of his subjects that had sort of gained victory over Napoleon, and that Napoleon had actually surrendered to the British Navy. Napoleon wanted to surrender to the British because he believed that we were fair and wouldn't torture him or do anything awful to him. So that was another feather in our cap, that Napoleon had insisted on surrendering to the British. And the celebrations, of course, were enormous, and the Prince Regent absolutely loved celebrations, spending money and doing things on a grand scale. That was exactly what he loved more than anything else. So the celebrations were absolutely amazing. The Waterloo chamber in Windsor was sort of dedicated to the battle, and of course still there today, open to the public. Many of you have probably been there and seen it. So the Prince Regent was absolutely in his element when it came to celebrating victories and entertaining the representatives of foreign powers. You know, the Tsar came from Russia, and the Prince, on those occasions, we could feel proud of him because he knew how to behave. He had these, beautiful manners, showed enormous courtesy and enormous generosity, because it wasn't his money he was spending, it was the people's money. But that all went down very well. And the fact that he was strutting around in his army uniform, imagining that he had been at the actual Battle of Waterloo, people sort of passed that off and just rejoiced in the fact that we were, for a time anyway, top nation in Europe. So that's the background of the war and its consequences. Another thing that the Prince was good at, very knowledgeable, was the fine arts. He had an eye. That expression is quite strange. He had an eye. he was particularly interested in architecture, and he has left a great legacy, particularly in London. He had great discernment. He knew what looked good and what didn't look good.
Recording in progress.
He was a great patron, and he helped many creative people. Oh,
Don't worry. Martin, I'm sorry, you're going to have to turn that other computer off.
Okay.
Martin, can you turn Judy back on? You've scrambled everything by putting that one on.
Can you hear now?
Yeah, you're up and running again. Sorry, Judy, off you go.
My fault.
that's okay. Right. So a respected patron of the arts and supported a lot of creative people as a patron. And he was responsible for transforming the West End of London. Regent Street, of course, pardon me, called after him. With a new thoroughfare driven through from Regent's Park to the Regent's main London home, Carlton House. And of course, that is now one of the best shopping areas in the whole country. Buckingham Palace, he improved Buckingham Palace and extended it and beautified it. And then, of course, Regent's Park, including Regent's Canal, all these places called after him. Various terraces around Green Park and Hyde Park, now used by embassies. Some of them are very posh hotels, but they are very fine sort of Regency terraces. But his main architectural achievement was Brighton Pavilion. Again, some of you will have been to Brighton Pavilion and seen it. I haven't been. Seen lots of pictures of it. There was a building there already, and the Prince wanted somewhere away from London where he could meet or even live with his wife, Maria Fitzherbert. Of course, remember, he married her in secret, and it wasn't actually a valid marriage for the reasons we explained. So that's why he chose Brighton. But instead of just making that house a bit larger, he got totally carried away and spent an absolute fortune, an unbelievable amount of money in building an amazing structure, a sort of mixture of Indian and Chinese style, which had become kind of fashionable at the time. Expense no object, obviously it should have been, but it wasn't. The Prince wanted the best of everything, regardless of price. In fact, the more expensive it was, the happier he seemed to be, like some rich people today. Just wanted the very, very best, something that was outstanding, something that was going to amaze people when they went. He wanted to make his mark. So Brighton Pavilion is how he's remembered by many people, because the building itself is a bit crazy, and the decor, the inside, the way the rooms are decorated, completely over the top. Was completely over the top then, and it is even more so now with minimalist style being fashionable and popular now. people can hardly believe how intricate and complicated and ornate Brighton Pavilion is when you go from room to room. And one example of the extravagance was the banqueting room, which had a huge dome ceiling, and the centerpiece was a silver dragon from which hung an enormous gasolier. That was the latest technology. It wasn't just candles, it was lighted by gas, which was very, very advanced. The whole thing weighed a ton and cost £5,613, 9 shillings. I think the 9 shillings is quite funny. I mean, that was a fortune, an absolute fortune in those days. It's an unbelievably ridiculous amount of money. And it drew very negative comments from quite a lot of people who went to see the Brighton Pavilion long before it was finished, because the Prince opened it, so because he wanted everybody to see how amazing it was long before it was completed. So people, his special guests were invited to go and have a look at the Brighton Pavilion as a work in progress. And Princess Lieven, who was the wife of the Russian ambassador, was you could say almost like a journalist today. She was a commentator, she kept a diary, she kept a journal. She was also very witty and very sarcastic. And she wrote, "I do not believe that there have been such magnificence and such luxury," she meant ever before. "There is something effeminate about it, which is disgusting." she wasn't at all impressed by the Brighton Pavilion and the extravagance of the interior. And many other people have reflected that same view, that it was really rather horrible. The Regent had been totally hands-on. Many of the designs were his designs, interpreted by somebody with skill. I mean, he wasn't himself an architect, but he would do sketches and explain exactly what he wanted. Or he would be given a whole series of pictures and drawings of what something could look like, and he would choose the one that he liked. So he's very, very involved in the building and the decorating of Brighton Pavilion. But sadly, when it was completed, finally completed, he was too ill to enjoy it. And he actually spent most of his reign in Windsor. Queen Victoria absolutely hated the Brighton Pavilion because she understood how expensive it had been, how outrageous the style was, and she felt embarrassed about it, that the royal family had spent so much money on it when things in the country were so difficult. We'll come to that next time. And so she sold it to Brighton Town Council, and the furniture and fittings were then distributed to other royal residences. They didn't go to waste. The architect John Nash, Martin's found a lovely picture of him. He was the chief architect at the time, and certainly responsible for the changes in London. So the Prince Regent was seen as an eccentric, possibly mad, but certainly weird. Weird in his views, and weird in the fact that he never seemed to understand that money wasn't infinite. You know, we're talking now about, have you found the money tree? Well, he apparently thought he had. It never crossed his mind that somebody else was having to pay for it. He was massively, massively in debt, and that didn't seem to bother him either. That's why he had to get married, because Parliament was so tired of helping him out with his massive debts. Another aspect of the Regency, beaux and dandies, sometimes called fops. I didn't actually include that word, but another word that was used for this was men, not women. These were men who became obsessed with their appearance. Really, totally obsessed. And it got worse after 1815. We say worse in the sense that people were spending a small fortune on their appearance. And there were many, many hostile comments about this. There is a theory that after a war, after a lengthy conflict, something happens to fashion. It's a very interesting theory. Certainly borne out after the Napoleonic War came to an end in 1815, 20 years of war, followed by 1815, sudden peace. Certainly the fashion for women, men and women, changed rather dramatically. And certainly after the First World War, an even more dramatic change in fashion, that skirts for women went short, they chopped off their hair and had their hair shaved at the back like men, shingled it was called. They started to wear makeup, they started to smoke, their legs showed, whereas for centuries and centuries women weren't supposed to have legs. Certainly didn't show their legs, and then all of a sudden, in the 1920s, skirts were knee length or even shorter. Absolutely astounding and shocking. And instead of wearing, having pinched in waists and wearing corsets to make their waist small, a boy-like look became fashionable. Waists didn't exist. Women abandoned the corsets and had to look androgynous, had to look like men. And the emphasis was then on legs, which was outrageous. I mean, older women were absolutely horrified. They couldn't imagine what had happened. And that girls were chopping their hair off and making it short and wearing makeup. It was such a shock to the older generation. Not so much after the Second World War, because it was difficult to get the clothes, it was difficult to get the fabrics. But then in 1947, the new look came in, and that was quite a dramatic change, but not so much after the Second World War. But certainly you can argue that very dramatic change after the Napoleonic War, 20 years of war, and the First World War. Dramatic change. But what was so amazing about the Regency period was that it was men, right, and the women had changed their style to a funny high-waisted, looking as though they were wearing, they'd come out in their 90s, and no more corsets and no more big bell-shaped skirts, and very, very simple clothing for women. White, very fashionable. White muslin, thin, floaty clothes, trying to look like Greek goddesses, basically, with a kind of classical look. But the men were sort of outrageous in their desire to attract attention. It was very much a sort of notice me, notice me, notice me, look at me, which had never been a characteristic of men. Notice me, or certainly not civilian men. Men in uniform were allowed to strut around a bit because they felt that they deserved to. But this was men challenging other men in how smart they thought they looked, or how they were following the latest style, the latest fashion. It was called being à la mode. Many of the styles were coming from France, but they were coming over in a very rapid way. You could be out of style, out of line very, very quickly. No sooner had you bought yourself an outfit that you thought was à la mode, then suddenly it wasn't à la mode anymore, and you had to buy a different style, you had to buy different clothes. So it was very much a consumer situation. So this is what somebody wrote in 1827. This is a visiting German, Prince von Pückler-Muskau, recorded the necessities of a London dandy. An elegant, that's another name for a fop or a dandy or a beau, an elegant requires per week 20 shirts, 24 pocket handkerchiefs, 30 neck handkerchiefs, unless he wears black ones, a dozen washing waistcoats, and stockings à discrétion. A dandy cannot get on without dressing 3 or 4 times a day. First, in breakfast toilette, a chintz dressing gown and Turkish slippers. Second, morning riding dress, frock coat, boots and spurs. Third, dinner dress, dress coat and shoes. Fourth, ball dress with pumps, a word signifying shoes as thin as paper. It says it was the final parade of the peacock before Victorian drabness set in and vivid colours were left to the military. It was also the culmination of a development in men's fashion which had been gathering pace during the 18th century. So this is what another commentator said. A mode or mod begins to be out of date in Paris just when it had been introduced at London by some English noblemen. The court and the first-rate nobility immediately take it up. It is next introduced about St. James's by those that ape the manners of the court, and by the time it has reached the city, a contrary mode already prevails at Paris, where the English, bringing with them the opposite mode, appear like the people of another world. In other words, how are you going to keep up with this constant change in fashion? Beaux, or macaronis as they were later in the country called, from their habit of frequenting almacs, where the dish of macaroni was first invented, were everywhere. Richard Steele wrote, this is another commentator, the town swarms with fine gentlemen. A nimble pair of heels, a smooth complexion, a full-bottom wig, a lace shirt, an embroidered suit, a pair of fringed gloves, a hat and feather. Any one or more of these and the like accomplishments ennobles a man and raises him above the vulgar in a female imagination. On the contrary, a modest, serious behaviour, a plain dress, a thick pair of shoes, a leathern belt, a waistcoat not lined with silk, and such like imperfections degrade a man, and are so many blots on his escutcheon, and so on and so forth. Now, by the time of the Regency, they had perfected the idea of dressing beautifully and then walking out of what was called promenade. You just walked up and down. You weren't going shopping. You had no particular reason for being outside except to show off and meet people and just walk up and down. It's called promenade, which again is a French word. And then it's spread to the seaside, and we call it a promenade, just walking up and down on just above the beach. Again, just to show who you are. Beau Nash was the first of these dandies to become a celebrity. He was the arbiter of fashion in Bath. And Nash devised a puppet show in which the Punch character appeared booted and spurred and refused all requests to remove the offending articles. My boots? Why, madam, you may as well bid me pull off my legs. I never go without boots. I never ride, I never dance without them. And this piece of politeness is quite the thing at Bath. We always dance at our town in boots, and the ladies often move minuets in riding hoods. Thus he goes on, the commentator says, till his mistress, grown impatient, kicks him off the stage. He says, from that time, few ventured to appear at the assemblies in Bath in a riding dress, and whenever any gentleman, through ignorance or haste, appeared in the room in boots, Nash would make up to him and, bowing in an arch manner, would tell him that he'd forgot his horse. So even boots, you have to be a little bit careful. Sometimes they were in, sometimes they were out. You have to be very careful what kind of boots you were wearing, whether they were highly polished or whether they were made to look as though you had just come in from riding, and so on and so forth. It was very, very hard to keep up. And then, of course, the great Beau Brummel took over in London, and he is the famous one that he was supreme during the Regency period because he was a great mate of George, Prince Regent. And he was a sort of dictator. He was the arbitrator. People followed him around in droves to see what he was wearing on any particular day. And the thing about Beau Brummell was that he didn't believe in extravagance. It was a completely new look. The new look was simplicity, good taste, no flamboyant colours or patterns, no fancy waistcoats, no brocade or damask. Chose his tailors with enormous care and, rather unusually, insisted on cleanliness, fine white linen, no perfume. A lot of men have been dousing themselves in all kinds of extravagant perfumes. He objected to perfumes. Clothes that fitted perfectly. He would reject one pair of trousers after another because they didn't fit perfectly. One jacket after another didn't fit perfectly. Cravats that were perfectly folded. There are all sorts of stories about his valet having 20 or 30 discarded cravats when people went round to visit Beau Brummell, because he kept sort of an open house because he was a celebrity. The cravat had to be perfectly folded before he felt able to go out and show himself in public. Because he had been spoiled by all this attention, he had a very superior manner, very sarcastic and imperious. And the prince admired him as a role model, that he was, to use a modern word, cool. Beau Brummell was cool, full of confidence. And the prince copied him, copied his style. And then they had a terrible falling out, stopped speaking to one another. Of course, it was very, very interesting for all the onlookers. What was going to happen? Were they ever going to make friends? The answer was no, they were not ever going to make friends. And it culminated in a famous encounter, which a lot of you will have heard of, at the Argyle Assembly Rooms, when Prince Regent had become obese and was very self-conscious about it, but did nothing about it, just went on eating and eating and eating. So he lost his lovely figure, he put on weight, he wasn't in good shape anymore. And Beau Brummell famously asked the prince's companion, Lord Albanley, "Who's your fat friend?" And that meant the end of any question of a reconciliation, of them making up. There was absolutely no way after that that Beau Brummell had publicly humiliated and insulted the head of state, Prince Regent. Who's your fat friend? It's icy and so rude, unbelievable. Showed how much confidence he had, that it wouldn't be the end of his career, but it had humiliated the Prince Regent. Sadly, Brummell got himself into massive debt. He was nearly as foolish as the prince when it came to money. Celebrity had gone to his head, and he just spent ridiculous amounts of money, and he was ruined by his gambling addiction. He had to leave this country because, and leave many his debts behind. He was being pursued by debt collectors and people to whom he owed money. Went to live in France, eventually imprisoned for debt in France, and became a pauper recluse. Died alone. A tragic end for somebody who had been the talk of the town and an absolutely top celebrity. He had been a talking point for so many years, and that was a very, very tragic way to end his life. He got dementia and let himself go terribly, so people did go and see him and were horrified at the way he was living, that he was living in squalor. So that was a very sad way for the prince, for this very noted man to end his life. So those are sort of characteristics of the Regency period, and Martin's found a wonderful picture, well, quite a number of wonderful pictures of the dandies getting themselves ready. They padded themselves out. If they hadn't got the right shape, if they were too skinny, then they used artificial means and wore padding. And Martin's found some lovely cartoon pictures of people of the men wearing padding in various places, so their trousers or their pantaloons would fit correctly. Not just shoulder pads, but pads in all sorts of other places. So it took them hours and hours to get ready, which is why they were mocked. But these men had got nothing better to do. They were wealthy. They had farm managers. They had people doing everything for them. They didn't need to lift a finger. So they could spend all day, if necessary, getting ready to go out in the evening. One of the interesting things is in 1818, there were 14 different ways to fasten a cravat. Absolutely ridiculous. All had names. So you could tell your valet or your body servant which style you wanted to have. I mean, you didn't tie your own cravat, somebody tied it for you. The horse collar, the barrel knot, the Napoleon, the American, 14 different ways of tying a cravat, quite ridiculous. And it caused many hours just looking at themselves in the mirror. And the manufacturers of mirrors had a field day creating what were called looking glasses, which were still found them today, of course, longer mirrors, usually on a swivel, so you could sort of see yourself from slightly different angles. You could see yourself full length and rejoice in how wonderfully smart you looked, but then feeling a bit nervous that when you actually went outside, you might find that the fashion had changed and that you weren't as fashionable as you thought you were. All completely, well, fatuous, really. But it implied that you had lots of money, lots of time, and that you wanted to show off. And it was noted that it was particularly men who hadn't been in the army who were doing the showing off. It was almost a sort of psychological, I wasn't a soldier, I wasn't a sailor, I haven't featured in a battle, but look at me anyway, don't I look magnificent? And that's probably what was wrong with the Prince Regent, that he was jealous that he hadn't actually led his armies into battle. So then he fantasized and totally came to believe that he had.
Can I interject there a minute, Julie? I'm thinking back to the teddy boy era.
Yes.
Where many gentlemen of a certain age now will remember tying Windsor knots in their ties and wearing winkle pickers and impossibly tight trousers. It does go round, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Well, somebody wrote this before the Regency period. This is actually 1753, which is a lampoon, a verse called Monsieur à la mode. I'll just read a bit of it because it's funny. Take a creature that nature hath formed without brains, whose skull naught but nonsense and sonnets contains, with a mind where conceit with follies allied, set off by assurance and unmeaning pride, with commonplace jests for to tickle the ear, with mirth where no wisdom could ever appear, that to the defenceless can strut and look brave, though he to cowardice shows he's a slave. And now, for to dress up my bow with a grace, let a well-frizzled wig be set off from his face, and so on and so forth, which is interesting that people had enjoyed satire just as we do. They enjoyed mockery of the rich, even the famous. They enjoyed pulling people down who put themselves up on a pedestal. And it was also interesting that we are a free country. We were the land of liberty, and therefore there were cartoons mocking the Prince Regent, and when he'd been the Prince of Wales, as he put weight on, more and more vicious cartoons, really, which I think people would find a bit embarrassing today. But amazingly, we, alone in Europe, really, had the right, the privilege of mocking the royal family and showing that we despised them, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. In other countries, you would have been arrested, you would have been put in prison, possibly tortured, possibly put to death as a traitor. So it's something to be proud of, that in spite of the fear of revolution, which is another characteristic of the age, in spite of that, the fear that we were going to copy France and overthrow our royal family and set up a republic, we still had freedom of the press and freedom for cartoonists, although they were called lampoons in those days, to freely mock their elders and betters. Pretty amazing, something to be very proud of. Now, I didn't do notes on the changing scene in terms of politics and social changes, because I thought we'd do those next time. But it is interesting that the Regency period was a time of great change socially and economically. We've done the agrarian revolution, we studied the agrarian revolution, and we've studied the industrial revolution, and they were beginning to make their mark on society. So at the same time that the prince was spending a fortune on himself and on the Brighton Pavilion, people were actually starving. It was a very unhappy time for many people in this country following the Napoleonic War. And it is partly for that reason that the prince was hated as much as he was. And that he was hated as when he became king, that he did nothing for the hardships and the miseries that some people were suffering. We're talking of 1812, for example, Luddites being arrested and put to death for breaking machines. Why were they breaking machines? Who were the Luddites? Well, I'm sure you know, they were working men, working class men, desperate because their livelihood was being threatened by machines. And their response to that, they couldn't join trade unions. Trade unions were illegal at the time. We will come to that as well. Trade unions were illegal. The only recourse they had was to damage the machines that were taking away their livelihood. That handloom weavers particularly were struggling, desperately struggling to make a living. Machines could do what they did and could do the work much more quickly, much more cheaply. And so there were many people who were threatened by machines. And women and children could get jobs in factories and mills. They could look after the machines. Men were redundant. And in desperation, they decided that the only way, the only thing they could think of to fight for their families, to put bread on the table, was to destroy the machines. So that is a characteristic of the Regency period. Men driven to desperation and willing to risk their life. The government brought in the death penalty. It's unbelievable. The government brought in the death penalty for damaging machines. And men were still willing to risk that outcome because they couldn't see any other way forward. They couldn't see any alternative. Farm labourers' wages had gone gone down. Because of the long war, prices have gone up. Certainly taxes have gone up. And the rich, of course, rather than just facing higher taxes and having a slightly lower income, simply put their rents up for the landowners put rents up for their tenant farmers. The tenant farmers then decided, oh, I'm having to pay more rent, I will pay lower wages to my workforce. So it filtered down to the people who could least bear this situation, and the pay for farm labourers went down and down. And we have to remember there was no social services, there was no welfare state. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. You could go, the only welfare was the parish. If you didn't go to church, then the parish could refuse to help you. There were workhouses, but again, they were run by the parish. There was no welfare state, there was no unemployment benefit. If you got injured at work, no payment. We're talking a period of time when people were, as they are in many countries today, desperate. If they couldn't work, then the family would go without food. So this is like the other side of the Regency period. And the government panicking, the other characteristic, panicking about revolution. So if the workers did assemble, if the workers did group together and have a protest meeting, the government and the local authorities were very, very nervous, because they thought they were cooking up a revolution, because that's what had happened in France. Workers had got together and ultimately had overthrown the government, executed the royal family and many, many aristocrats, and set up a republic. So that's also the background to the Regency period. The huge difference between the very, very poor and the very, very rich, and a massive gulf, which of course is not healthy for any community. What are the poor going to do about their poverty and their hardships? Are they just going to accept that they're on the verge of starvation, or are they going to try and do something about it? So I'm just going to read one or two comments about the prince, just to lighten the atmosphere and not leave everybody being totally depressed. But next time we are going to look at the political and social situation following 1815. Now, these are comments made about George IV. Some of them after he died, some of them written during his lifetime. The Duke of Wellington, a man I think we should respect, his opinion we should respect. This is what he said about the king. This was after the king died, so he's including his whole life. The most extraordinary compound of talent, wit, buffoonery, obstinacy, and good feeling. In short, a medley of the most opposite qualities, with a great preponderance of good that I ever saw in any character in my life. And that's quite a knowledgeable, perceptive summary of George IV. Leigh Hunt. This delightful, blissful, wise, pleasurable, honourable, virtuous, true and immortal prince was a violator of his word, a libertine, over head and ears in debt and disgrace, a despiser of domestic ties, the companion of gamblers and demi-reps, a man who has just closed half a century without one single claim on the gratitude of his country or the respect of posterity. That's a bit of a knife in the ribs. Then William Makepeace Thackeray. I look through all his life and recognise but a bow and a grin. I tried to take him to pieces and find silk stockings, padding, stays, what's the old name for corset, a coat with frogs, that doesn't mean frogs, that's a kind of decoration made of ribbon, and a fur collar, a star and blue ribbon, a pocket handkerchief prodigiously scented, one of Truefitt's best nutty brown wigs, reeking with oil, a set of teeth, and a huge black stock, as a cravat, under waistcoats, more under waistcoats, and then nothing. That is brilliant. That there was nothing to the Prince of Wales, nothing to the regent, nothing to the king. There was nothing except his clothes. And then Charles Greville, who was a commentator, a political commentator, he always had money. Well, that's a good way to start, rather dramatic, because the idea was that he never had any money, he was always in debt. He always had money. When he died, they found £10,000 in his boxes and money scattered about everywhere, a great deal of gold. There were above 500 pocketbooks of different dates, and in every one, money, guineas, £1 notes, 1, 2, or 3 in each. There never was anything like the quantity of trinkets and trash that they found. He had never given away or parted with anything. There was a prodigious quantity of hair, women's hair, of all colours and lengths, some locks with the powder and pomatum still sticking to them, heaps of women's gloves, gage d'amour which he had got at balls, and with the perspiration still marked on the fingers. Notes and letters in abundance, but not much that was of any political consequence, and the whole was destroyed. And then his sister, Princess Elizabeth, just 4 words. He was all heart. Very interesting. 3 condemning him, saying that he was pretty worthless. A balanced analysis from the Duke of Wellington, and a very positive comment from his sister. So next time, hopefully, we will look at the political situation and the social situation and try and get us a sort of rounded picture of this very important time, the beginning of the 19th century, where we find a lot of parallels with life today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Judy.
Bye then. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks, both.
Fortnight time.
Thank you.
Looking forward to it, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll get there a minute to stop the
Can I move?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, Martin, I had to ask you to shut the other computer off. We were getting horrendous feedback from it.
I was trying to look and see what the picture looked like on another computer, but never mind.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
If you wanted to do that, what you needed to have done was start it up before so we could mute it, because what we were hearing Judy and hearing her from the computer and feeding back as well on your computer.
So you had
yeah. And